The line cook at the corner diner had one rule: never speak first, never explain himself, let people think whatever they wanted. For 3 years, that was enough. He came in before sunrise. He left after the last plate was scrubbed clean. In between, he cooked. He wiped counters. He said almost nothing at all. The owner's son, Trent Hale, thought that meant weak. He mocked the cook's silence in front of the whole staff more than once. "Cat got your tongue, old man?" he snapped one morning, loud enough for the dish room to hear. The cook wiped the counter. He said nothing. He never did. But when a customer's face turned blue at table 9 and nobody in the diner knew what to do, the silence broke. The cook crossed the room in 4 steps. His voice, when it finally came, was calm, steady, a voice that had given orders before. Later, someone would remember one word he muttered under his breath while he worked. Not his name, a call sign, something else entirely. Welcome to Corner Diner Stories. Subscribe for more stories from the corner table. The diner sat on the corner of Route 9 and Miller Street, a town small enough that people still waved from their porches. Faded red booths, a bell over the door that never stopped ringing, a grill that had cooked 100,000 breakfasts. They called it Corner Diner because nobody remembered its real name anymore. The line cook had worked the early shift for 3 years. 6 a.m. to 2. Eggs, bacon, the Tuesday meatloaf special. He knew the order before the customer finished asking. Nobody knew much else about him. He wore his sleeves rolled down, even in July. He kept a folded photograph in his wallet that he never showed anyone. He flinched, just slightly, at the sound of a dropped pan, then caught himself. Went back to work like nothing happened. Marge noticed. Marge noticed everything. 61 years old, 18 years at the corner diner, a husband buried after 2 tours, gone before she turned 30. She never asked the cook questions. She just left an extra cup of coffee at his station most mornings and never mentioned it. Trent Hale noticed nothing. 28 years old, home from business school, put in charge of the diner his father built because his father's knees were going and somebody had to run the place while Frank Hale figured out how to retire. Trent did not understand the cook. And what Trent did not understand, Trent mocked. "You're not paid to stand there and stare into space," he said one Tuesday, snapping his fingers in front of the cook's face. The cook had not been staring into space. He had been listening to a siren pass on Route 9, counting the seconds until it faded. He always did. "Yes, sir," the cook said. 2 words, that was all. Trent smirked at the staff behind him like he'd won something. He hadn't. His real name was Ray. Almost nobody at the diner used it. Frank Hale did, sometimes quietly, when Trent wasn't around. Frank had hired Ray 4 years ago, off a stool at the VFW post 2 towns over, after watching him sit alone for 3 hours with an untouched cup of coffee going cold. Frank never asked what happened overseas. He just offered a job, 6 a.m. to 2. No questions. "A man doesn't owe you his whole life story," Frank told Trent once, "just because you sign his paycheck." Trent hadn't listened. Trent rarely listened to anything that didn't come with a title attached. He liked people who talked, people who filled silence with resumes and references and the right kind of confidence. Ray filled silence with silence, and Trent had decided, somewhere in his 28 years, that silence meant a man had nothing worth saying. He was wrong. The mockery didn't stop with one Tuesday. It never does. 2 weeks after the Fry comment, Trent caught Ray standing perfectly still by the back door during a thunderstorm, both hands braced against the frame, eyes fixed on nothing. "What? Scared of a little rain?" Trent laughed, loud enough for 2 waitresses to hear. Ray didn't answer. His chest was tight. His breathing had gone shallow and controlled, the way a man breathes when he is counting seconds between the flash and the sound, out of habit, out of a decade of habit he couldn't unlearn. Thunder was not gunfire. He knew that. His body had never fully agreed. "It's just weather, man," Trent said, shaking his head, already walking away. Marge had seen the whole thing from the coffee station. She didn't say a word to Trent. She simply walked over, stood beside Ray at the door, and watched the rain with him until the thunder passed. She never once asked why. That was the difference between the two of them. Trent asked questions to make himself feel bigger. Marge stood beside people and let the silence do what it needed to do. A month later, it happened again. A supply truck backfired in the parking lot, a sharp, flat crack that echoed off the brick wall. Ray dropped to one knee behind the prep counter before his mind caught up with his body. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then he stood, brushed off his apron, and went back to dicing onions like nothing had happened. Trent had walked in just in time to see the tail end of it. Did you just duck? Trent asked, half laughing, not understanding what he was looking at. Drop my knife, Ray said. It wasn't the truth. It was close enough to keep the conversation from going anywhere Trent didn't deserve to go. Trent didn't push. He just filed it away as one more strange thing about the strange, silent man his father kept around, and went back to his clipboard and never once wondered what kind of a life could teach a grown man's body to hit the floor before a truck backfired twice. The worst of it came a week before Walter Higgins ever choked on a bite of chicken-fried steak. A regional manager from the diner chain that supplied their napkins and coffee filters had stopped by for a routine visit, clipboard of his own in hand, and Trent, eager to impress him, had walked the man straight through the kitchen without warning. "This is our line cook," Trent said, gesturing at Ray the way a man might gesture at a piece of equipment. "Doesn't say much. Gets the job done, mostly." "Mostly?" the regional manager asked, raising an eyebrow. "He's a little slow," Trent said and laughed, a short, careless sound, the kind of laugh that costs the person laughing nothing and the person being laughed at everything. "But he's cheap, and my dad likes him so." Ray had kept his eyes on the grill. He had not looked up. He had not said a single word. But something in his jaw had tightened that day that had nothing to do with the heat of the flat top, and Marge, watching from the pass-through window, had felt something close to fury on his behalf. Fury she had no right to feel louder than he was allowed to feel it himself. So she said nothing either, and simply refilled his coffee twice that shift instead of once. The truth, if Trent had ever asked the right way, went back 11 years, to a valley outside Kandahar province, in the spring of 2011. Ray had been a combat medic then, 3rd Platoon, 82nd Airborne, 24 years old, and already the man his unit called when things went sideways, because his hands didn't shake and his voice didn't crack, not even when the world around him was doing both at once. His best friend in that unit was a soldier named Marcus Webb, call sign Preacher, because he used to read scripture out loud to anyone who'd sit still long enough to listen, and because he had a way of making even the worst days feel survivable. On the 14th of April, their convoy hit a pressure plate on a dirt road nobody had walked in weeks. Ray remembered the sound before he remembered anything else. A flat, deafening crack, and then a silence so complete it felt like the world had been switched off. Then the screaming started. He remembered running. He remembered his knees hitting gravel beside Marcus, whose leg was gone below the knee, whose face had gone the color of old paper, whose pulse under Ray's 2 fingers was a thin, fading thread. "Stay with me," Ray said, pressing both hands against the wound, feeling the warmth of it soak through his gloves. "Not today." The radio was screaming for a medevac that was 11 minutes out. 11 minutes. Ray counted every second of them out loud, low and steady, a voice built to hold a dying man's attention. "Not here," he said, tying off what he could tie off, pressing where pressure needed to be pressed, doing everything a decade of training had built into his hands so his mind wouldn't have to think about what his eyes were seeing. "Not on my watch." 3 lines, over and over. Not today, not here, not on my watch. He said them for Marcus. He said them again 3 months later, over a 19-year-old private named Danny Okafor, who had stepped wrong on a road nobody had cleared properly, and whose chest Ray had to open with his own 2 hands in the dust, while mortars fell close enough to rattle his teeth. Danny lived. Danny went home to Ohio and sent Ray a photograph every Christmas for 6 years afterward. A wife, then a daughter, then a second daughter. Until one year the photographs simply stopped, and Ray never learned why. And some nights that unfinished silence hurt almost as much as the one that had an ending. He said them over a sergeant whose name he still would not speak out loud, not even now, not even to himself. He said them over a translator who wasn't technically his to save, but whose family Ray still thought about on quiet mornings, wondering if a boy who should be 22 now had made it out of that province at all. He said them, later that same year, over 4 more men in that valley, in worse light, with worse odds, and every single time the man lived to hear a hospital ceiling instead of a dirt road. Every time except one. 11 minutes wasn't always 11 minutes. Sometimes it was 9, sometimes it was 14. On the 14th of April, it was 14 minutes and 30 seconds, and Marcus Webb's pulse went quiet under Ray's fingers at minute 12, and no amount of pressure, no amount of 3-word prayers muttered into the dust, brought it back. Ray held his friend's hand until the helicopter landed anyway. They started calling him Deacon after that. Not because of the scripture, that had been Marcus's gift, not his. They called him Deacon because of the way he spoke over the wounded, calm and low and certain, like a man delivering a blessing he refused to let go unanswered. Like a man daring the universe to argue with him, he carried that name home. He never used it again. He came back to a country that thanked him at airports and then forgot him by dinner. He tried 3 jobs in 3 different states before Frank Hale found him at that VFW post, staring at a cold cup of coffee, and offered him something nobody else had thought to offer, a place where nobody asked him to explain himself. 6 a.m. to 2, eggs, bacon, the Tuesday meatloaf special. It was enough. It had to be enough. Some days it almost was. Frank Hale knew a piece of the story, not all of it. Enough. He'd found the discharge papers once, by accident, tucked in the bottom of a duffel bag Ray had left in the diner's back office during a slow winter week, waiting on a used truck he couldn't afford yet. Frank hadn't read them. He'd just seen the seal and the rank and closed the bag and never mentioned it again. "You don't have to tell me anything," Frank said to him once, the 2 of them alone in the kitchen after closing, both of them tired in the particular way of men who'd spent their whole lives working with their hands. "I just want you to know there's a seat here, however long you need it." Ray had nodded. He hadn't trusted his voice that night either. Frank never told Trent what he suspected. Some things, he believed, a man had to reveal on his own time, in his own way, or not reveal at all. Trent would learn it the hard way, Frank sometimes thought, watching his son bark orders at a man who had once carried the weight of other men's lives across open ground under fire. He was right. He just didn't know how soon. Frank had his own reasons for hiring the way he did, though he rarely spoke of them either. His own father had come home from a different war decades earlier and had spent the rest of his life working a factory floor where nobody ever asked him a single question about what he'd carried back with him. Frank had watched that silence eat away at a good man for 30 years, slow and quiet, the way rust works on a truck left out in the weather. He'd sworn, somewhere in his own middle age, that if he ever ran a business of his own, it would be a place where a man's past didn't have to explain itself to earn a seat. Ray was not the first veteran Frank had quietly hired. He was simply the one who happened to be standing at table 9 on a Thursday when the whole town finally found out what kind of man Frank Hale had been building a diner around, one quiet hire at a time, for longer than anyone had noticed. Trent would learn that part of the story, too, eventually. Just not yet. The lunch rush at the corner diner ran from 11:30 to 1. Every day the same. Farmers in from the fields, retirees who came for the coffee and stayed for the company, a couple of state troopers who liked the pie, and Walter Higgins. Walter came every Thursday, 74 years old. a retired school teacher who had taught 3 generations of the town their multiplication tables. He always sat at table 9, always ordered the chicken fried steak, always tipped in exact change because he liked the ritual of counting it out. His wife had passed 2 winters back. The diner had become, in its own quiet way, the only place he still felt like somebody was glad to see him. Ray knew Walter's order before Walter sat down. He knew a lot of orders. It was one of the few things about this job that felt like peace. At 4 minutes past noon, Trent walked into the kitchen with a clipboard and a complaint. "You're running slow on the fries again," he said, not looking up. "Customers are noticing. I'm noticing." Ray said nothing. He turned the fryer basket. Golden, even. He had learned patience in places far worse than a diner kitchen at lunch rush, and he was not going to lose it over Trent Hale and a clipboard. "Are you even listening to me?" Trent snapped. "Yes, sir," Ray said. Trent's jaw tightened. He hated that phrase. He hated how flat it came out. No fear in it. No scramble to please him. He wanted a reaction. He never got one. "You know," Trent said, lowering his voice so the other cooks wouldn't hear, "my father only keeps you around because he feels sorry for you. Whatever you were before this, it doesn't matter here. Here, you're just the guy who's slow on the fries." Ray's hands did not shake. They had learned a long time ago not to shake when someone was cruel to him. They only shook sometimes late at night, when the house was too quiet, and his mind went back to a valley he had not seen in over a decade. "Yes, sir," he said again, and pulled the fryer basket. Trent walked away, satisfied with nothing, the way he usually was. Out on the floor, Walter Higgins was 3 bites into his chicken fried steak when something went wrong. Marge was the first to notice. She was refilling coffee 2 tables over when she heard it. Not a cough, not a choke, but a silence where a sound should have been. Walter's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth. His other hand had gone to his throat. "Walter?" she said. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His face was turning a color it shouldn't turn. "Walter!" The diner noticed all at once, the way a room does when something breaks the rhythm of an ordinary day. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze over plates. A young mother pulled her toddler close without knowing why. Walter rose halfway out of his chair, both hands at his throat now. No sound coming out of him at all. Not a wheeze, not a gasp, nothing. Trent stood at the register, 10 feet away, a phone in his hand and no idea what to do with it. "Somebody," he started, and didn't finish. The kitchen door swung open. Ray moved before he decided to move. That was the part he could never explain to people who hadn't been trained for it. His body simply knew, the way it had known a decade ago, in places where hesitation cost lives measured in seconds. 4 steps. That was all it took him to cross the floor. "I've got him," Ray said, calm, flat. A voice built for chaos, not for fry stations. "Everybody back up. Give him room." Marge backed up without question. Trent did not move at all. He simply stared, the phone still in his hand, his mouth slightly open. Ray was already behind Walter, arms wrapped low around his ribs, one fist against the soft space above his navel, the other hand wrapped over it. He had done this before, on men twice Walter's size, in places where the next thrust might be the only thing standing between a soldier and a body bag. "Stay with me," Ray said quietly, more to himself than to Walter. "Not today." 1 thrust. Nothing. Walter's face had gone from red to a deeper, darker color now. Ray's mind ran a clock he hadn't asked it to run. 4 seconds without air, then 8, then 12, the same countdown that had haunted him in 100 worse rooms than this one. Not here. A second thrust. Walter's body jerked. Still nothing. The room had gone dead silent. Even the bell over the door seemed to hold its breath. "Not on my watch." The third thrust dislodged it. A piece of steak, no bigger than a coin, hit the floor. Walter's chest heaved. A sound came out of him, ragged, desperate, beautiful, the sound of air finding its way back into a body that had almost forgotten how to hold it. Ray eased him down into the booth seat, 2 fingers already at his wrist, counting. "You're all right," he said. "You're breathing. Look at me. You're breathing." Walter's eyes were wet. His hands were shaking. Ray's were not. They had not shaken once. Silence. The whole diner stood frozen in it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A coffee pot sat forgotten in Marge's hand, tilting slowly toward the floor, and nobody noticed that either. Then, all at once, the diner exhaled. Someone started clapping. Someone else was crying. A trooper who had been 3 bites into his pie was already on his radio, calling it in, though there was hardly anything left to call in. Trent stood exactly where he had been standing, phone still raised, face gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights. He had watched the whole thing. He had watched the man he called slow move faster than anyone else in the room. He had watched hands that never shook do the one thing that mattered most in the 4 seconds that mattered most, while Trent's own hands had done nothing at all. "How did you—" Trent started. Ray didn't answer. He was still crouched beside Walter, checking his pulse, checking his color, murmuring something too low for anyone else to hear. Marge heard it, just barely. "Not today. Not on my watch. Not you." 3 lines. The same 3 lines, over and over, low and steady, like a man saying a prayer he had said 100 times before, in 100 places far from a diner in a small town on Route 9. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes later, 2 of them. A younger one who checked Walter's vitals with brisk efficiency, and an older one, gray at the temples, who watched Ray for a long moment before he said anything at all. "You did that yourself?" the older paramedic asked. "The thrusts, the positioning, that's not civilian technique." Ray shrugged. "Worked, didn't it?" "That's not what I asked." Ray said nothing. The paramedic crouched down next to him, lowering his voice the way people do when they've recognized something in another person's eyes. "I was a corpsman 12 years. I know what trained hands look like when they move. Where'd you serve?" Ray's jaw tightened, just slightly. The same way it did at night, when the house was too quiet. "Kandahar province," he said finally. "A long time ago." The paramedic nodded slowly, like a door had opened that he'd been knocking on for a while. 82nd, combat medic, 3rd platoon. The paramedic's eyes narrowed, thinking. Then something shifted in his face. Recognition, disbelief, and something close to reverence, all at once. "There's a story," he said quietly. "Guys still tell it at reunions. A medic who wouldn't stop working on a man even after everybody else called it. Kept saying the same 3 words the whole time. Not today, not here, not on my watch. Pulled him back after 11 minutes with no pulse. They used to call that medic." He stopped, looked at Ray. Really looked. "Deacon," he said. Ray's throat tightened. He hadn't heard that word spoken out loud in 6 years. The diner had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the frozen silence of a crisis. The hushed, careful silence of people realizing they had been standing next to something they never understood. "Deacon," Marge repeated softly, testing the word. "They called him that because of what he said," the paramedic explained, standing now, addressing the room without quite meaning to. "Over every man he worked on. Not today, not here, not on my watch. Didn't matter if the man was already gone. He said it anyway, like a blessing, like he was daring the universe to argue with him." Walter, still catching his breath in the booth, reached out and gripped Ray's wrist. His eyes were full. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. But they carried the weight of every word Ray had swallowed in 3 years of silence. Ray nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. Trent stood apart from all of it, his phone finally lowered, his face doing something it rarely did. It looked almost like shame. "I called you slow," he said. Quiet, almost a whisper. "I called you. I said my father kept you around out of pity." Ray looked at him, not with anger. He didn't have the energy left for anger, not after 11 minutes and a decade-old ghost that had just walked back into the room. "You didn't know," Ray said simply. "That's not an excuse." "No," Ray agreed. "It isn't." He picked up a dish towel from his apron, wiped his hands, and walked back toward the kitchen. Not because he was finished, because the fryer basket was still waiting, and somewhere behind the counter, a stack of order tickets had not stopped coming just because a man had nearly died and lived. That was the thing about people like Ray. The work didn't stop. It never had. Not in a valley outside Kandahar in 2011, and not at a diner in a town small enough for everyone to know your name if you ever let them. Word traveled fast in a town that size. By the time Ray finished his shift, half of Miller Street already knew what had happened at Table 9. Walter's granddaughter, Emily, showed up at the diner that evening, still in her nursing scrubs from the hospital 2 towns over, and found Ray scrubbing down the grill after close. "You saved my grandpa's life," she said, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed in. "He's a good tipper," Ray said. It was the closest thing to a joke he'd made in 3 years. Emily laughed, and then, without quite meaning to, she started crying. "My dad was Army too," she said. 2 tours. He doesn't talk about it either. I used to think that meant he didn't have anything to say. I don't think that anymore." Ray set down the rag he was holding. "He has plenty to say," Ray told her. "Some of us just take longer finding the words. Doesn't mean they're not in there." Emily nodded, wiped her eyes, and left him a business card from the hospital's Veterans Outreach program before she went, in case he ever wanted someone to talk to who understood the particular weight of what he carried. He kept the card in his wallet next to the folded photograph. He didn't call the number that week. He didn't call it the week after either, but he kept the card. Some doors don't need to be opened right away. They just need to stay unlocked. The local paper ran a short piece 2 days later, tucked between a school board update and a notice about the county fair. "Watertown line cook saves choking customer," the headline read, above a grainy photo of the diner's front window that someone had taken from across the street. The article didn't mention Kandahar. It didn't mention Marcus or Danny or 11 minutes on a dirt road half a world away. It just said a diner employee had performed the Heimlich maneuver on a 74-year-old customer, and that the customer was recovering well, and that the diner's owner had declined to comment beyond saying his employee was, in his words, "the best man I know." Ray read it once, standing at the counter before his shift, coffee going cold in his hand. Then he folded the paper in half, set it under the register where nobody would look for it, and went back to cracking eggs. He didn't need the town to understand what it had witnessed. He only needed it to let him keep showing up quietly at 6 in the morning, the way he always had. But the town, it turned out, had other ideas. People he'd never spoken to started saying his name when they came in for breakfast. An elderly woman from 2 streets over left a pie on the counter with no note attached, just his name written on a piece of masking tape. A boy of maybe 9 asked his mother, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, if the quiet cook was a real soldier, and Ray had felt his ears go hot and had said nothing at all, and the boy had seemed satisfied with that answer anyway. It was strange, being seen. He had spent 3 years building a life specifically designed to avoid it. But there was something in the way this town looked at him now, not with pity, not with the careful, distant politeness people offered a stranger, but with something closer to gratitude, that didn't feel like the weight he'd expected it to feel like. It felt, instead, a little bit like being allowed to set something down. The newspaper article found its way online, the way small-town stories sometimes do, shared by someone's cousin, then a stranger of a stranger. 3 weeks after it ran, Ray received a message through the diner's website, forwarded to him by Frank with a note that just said, Thought you should see this yourself. It was from a woman named Priscilla Okafor in Columbus, Ohio. My father was Danny Okafor, the message read. He served with a medic he always called Deacon, who saved his life outside a village he never wanted to name. He talked about him until the day he died last spring. He always said if that medic ever came home in one piece, the world owed him a thank you it could never fully pay. I saw your name in an article my aunt shared, and something about the story made me look closer. I think you might be the man he meant. Ray read the message 3 times, standing alone in the diner's back office, the same office where Frank had once found his old discharge papers and quietly closed the bag. Danny Okafor had died last spring. The Christmas photographs had stopped 6 years ago, and Ray had spent 6 years assuming the worst kind of silence, the kind with no explanation, the kind a man's mind fills in on its own during the darkest hours of the night. He had never once considered that the photographs might have simply stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with him. A move, a busy year, a slow drift, the way most friendships eventually drift, war or no war. He wrote back that evening, longer than he'd written anything in years. He told Priscilla about the dust and the mortars and her father's stubborn refusal to lie still while Ray worked. He told her Danny had sent a photograph every Christmas, a wife, then a daughter, then a second daughter, and that he still had every single one of them in a shoebox at home, because some things a man keeps even when he doesn't know why. Priscilla wrote back with 3 photographs of her own. Her father, gray-haired now, at a backyard cookout. Her father holding her own daughter, born the year before he passed. Her father, in his dress uniform, decades younger, standing beside a medic whose face Ray hadn't seen in 11 years and would have known anywhere. Ray printed that last one and folded it carefully into his wallet, beside the photograph nobody had ever seen. It was, for the first time, a door he opened on purpose. 3 weeks later, the corner diner looked almost the same. Same red booths, same bell over the door, same Tuesday meatloaf special. But Trent Hale was different. He came in early now, not to check on the fries, to learn how the grill worked, how the tickets flowed, how Ray timed 6 orders at once without ever raising his voice. He didn't say much about it. He didn't need to. He started calling Ray by his name, not the cook, not old man. Ray. It was a small thing. It cost him nothing to say. But it took him 3 weeks and a stranger's collapsed lungs to learn it. I looked it up, Trent said one morning, setting a fresh cup of coffee at Ray's station without being asked. The way Marge always had, though he didn't know that was where he'd gotten the idea. The Bronze Star, the unit citation. You never told anybody. Nobody asked the right way, Ray said. Trent absorbed that. It landed somewhere it needed to land. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it. Ray turned the fryer basket. Golden. Even. I know, he said. And for the first time in 3 years, that was enough for both of them. Trent didn't stop there. He started reading quietly on his own time about what deployment did to a man's body and his sleep and his sense of a slamming door. He started noticing when Ray flinched, and instead of laughing, he simply lowered his voice, the way Marge always had, and gave him room. Small corrections. Nobody clapped for them. Nobody needed to. Ray noticed anyway. One evening, after close, Trent found Ray sitting alone at the counter, staring at nothing in particular, the way he sometimes did when the diner went quiet and the day finally caught up with him. You don't have to talk about it, Trent said, setting 2 mugs down and pouring coffee into both without asking. I just didn't want you sitting here by yourself. Ray looked at him for a long moment. 3 years of Tuesday comments and clipboard complaints stood between them, and neither man pretended otherwise. Kandahar, Ray said finally. There was a man named Marcus. Preacher, we called him. I couldn't save him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Trent simply nodded and sat with him, and let the silence be the kind of silence that holds a person up instead of the kind that isolates them. It was the longest conversation they'd ever had. It was also, in its way, the shortest. 4 sentences, most of them fragments, delivered across 2 mugs of coffee going cold. But something in the room had shifted, quietly, the way most important things shift, without any noise to announce it. 6 months later, Frank Hale stood on a small wooden platform he'd built himself in the corner of the dining room, next to a brass plaque that hadn't been there before. The diner was full. Walter Higgins sat at table 9, exactly where he always sat, his granddaughter beside him this time. Marge stood by the coffee station, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin she pretended was just for wiping counters. The gray-templed paramedic had come back, off duty, still in his civilian jacket, standing near the door like he wasn't sure he was allowed to take up space in a moment that belonged to somebody else. 4 years ago, Frank said, I gave a man a job because I saw somebody the world had forgotten to say thank you to. I didn't know his whole story. I didn't need to. I just knew he deserved a seat at the table, same as anybody. He looked over at Ray, who stood near the kitchen door, arms crossed, sleeves rolled down even though it wasn't July anymore. Starting today, the corner diner is hiring 1 veteran every season. Flexible hours. No questions asked before you're ready to answer them. We're calling it the Deacon Program. Ray's throat tightened. He hadn't asked for a program. He hadn't asked for a plaque or a platform or a room full of people looking at him like he was something more than a man who made good eggs and kept the fryer basket golden and even. But he didn't stop it either. Because somewhere in that room was a version of himself from 4 years ago, sitting alone at a VFW post with a cold cup of coffee, waiting for someone, anyone, to offer him a reason to keep showing up. And if this program meant one more man like that got a seat at a table before the silence swallowed him whole, then the platform and the plaque and all the eyes on him were worth it. Trent stepped up beside his father. He was holding a small envelope. We had it engraved, he said, handing it to Ray. Inside was a second brass plate, smaller, meant for the wall above the grill station. It read, "Not today, not here, not on my watch." Walter Higgins stood up next, leaning on his cane, waving off his granddaughter's hand when she moved to help him. I taught school in this town for 31 years, Walter said, his voice a little rough. I thought I'd met every kind of quiet there was. Shy kids, angry kids, kids who just didn't have the words yet. I never once thought to ask what kind of quiet a grown man might be carrying, until this man's hands gave me back a breath I thought I'd already lost. He looked at Ray. I get to see my granddaughter graduate nursing school next spring because of you. There's no plaque big enough for that. But I wanted to say it out loud anyway, in front of everybody because you never say anything out loud yourself. The room laughed gently, the way a room laughs when it's trying not to cry. Marge spoke last, before Frank handed Ray the small envelope. She didn't have a speech prepared. She just walked up, put a hand on Ray's shoulder and said, 18 years I've worked this counter. I buried a husband who never got the chance to grow old and quiet like you. I used to leave you coffee because it was the only thing I knew how to say without saying it. Her voice caught. I'm glad this town finally learned how to listen. Ray read it twice. Then he nodded, once, and let his eyes settle on it a moment longer than he meant to. Somewhere behind that plate, in a place none of them could see, a valley in Kandahar province still waited for him some nights, and a man named Marcus Webb still read scripture nobody else could hear. He hadn't forgotten. He never would. But for the first time in a long while, the weight of it felt like something he was allowed to set down, if only for a minute, in a diner full of people who finally understood what they were looking at. A year later, the first veteran hired through the Deacon program started his shift on a Monday morning. A young man named Isaiah, 26, quiet in the same particular way Ray had once been quiet, still learning how to let a room full of strangers see him without flinching. Ray trained him personally. 6 a.m. to 2. Eggs, bacon, the Tuesday meatloaf special. He didn't ask the young man questions he wasn't ready to answer. He just handed him an apron, showed him where the extra coffee was kept, and let the silence between them do what silence does best when it isn't lonely anymore. 2 months into the job, a small grease fire flared up on the flat top during the Saturday rush, and Isaiah's hands moved before his mind caught up with them. Steady, fast, certain, smothering it with a lid and baking soda before anyone else in the kitchen had even turned around. Ray watched him do it and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. He simply nodded once, the way Frank Hale had once nodded at him, and went back to the grill. Some lessons pass from one quiet man to another without a single word ever changing hands. Walter Higgins still came every Thursday. Chicken fried steak. Exact change counted out slow. He always asked for Ray's section now, and Ray always made sure he got it. Emily's business card was still in Ray's wallet. He had called the number eventually on a quiet Sunday in February and talked for 40 minutes to a stranger who understood exactly what he meant when he said the thunder still sounded like something else sometimes. It hadn't fixed everything. Nothing ever does, all at once. But it was a start, and a start was more than he'd let himself have in a long, long time. On the anniversary of the 14th of April, Ray closed the diner early, the way he did every year, and drove out past the county line to a small cemetery where nobody in Watertown would think to look for him. He sat on the grass in front of a headstone that read Marcus T. Webb, and he took out the photograph he had carried, folded for 11 years, the one nobody at the diner had ever seen. It showed 2 young soldiers, dust on their faces, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like the desert around them was nothing more than a bad joke they were both in on together. "Not today," Ray said quietly, the way he always did, though there was no crisis here to answer to, no clock counting down, nothing left to save. Just a man keeping a promise to another man who couldn't hold him to it anymore. "Got a kid training under me now," he said. "Reminds me of you. Doesn't shut up about scripture either." He almost smiled. "Diner's doing all right. Named a program after you, sort of. They don't know that part. I never told them your name. Just the word we used to say." He sat there until the light went gold and long across the grass. Then he folded the photograph back into his wallet, beside Danny Okafor's, beside Priscilla's letter, and drove home to a town that had finally learned how to sit beside his silence instead of asking it to explain itself. You thought his silence meant he had nothing to offer. You thought his quiet meant he had nothing left worth giving. You thought a line cook who kept his sleeves rolled down and his stories folded away was a man with no past worth knowing. Never mistake a quiet man for an empty one. Never mistake someone's silence for the size of what they're carrying. Never mistake the apron a person wears for the whole truth of who they are underneath it. This story is dedicated to the ones who serve without asking to be seen. The medics, the corpsmen, the quiet hands in every kitchen, every hallway, every small town, who carry what the rest of us will never fully understand. Some of them wear a uniform. Some of them just wear an apron. Not every hero introduces himself. Some of them just show up every morning at 6 a.m. sharp and get to work.